Here in this video we will mainly discuss about the security components: threat, vulnerability, and risk. We will discuss about different threats. At the end of video we will discuss about the phishing attack and its process flow. We will discuss the risk assessment with qualitative and quantitative approach. Then risk control and mitigation. We will discuss here about security triad. Components of security are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality. How secure is the information? How secure does the data need to be? Physical protections. Locked doors, fences, security guards, security cameras, safes. Electronic protections. Encryption, storage and in transit, passwords, firewalls, two-factor authentication. Failure of confidentiality occurs if someone can obtain and view the data. Integrity. How correct is the information? Has the data been modified during retrieval, in transit, or in storage? Hashing of files and information. Checksums during data transmission. Failure of integrity occurs if someone modifies the data being stored or when it is in transit. Availability. How much uptime is the system providing? Is the data accessible by users at all times? Redundancy in the system design, including components and data paths. Backup strategies and disaster recovery plan. Failure of availability occurs if the data cannot be accessed by the end user. We will discuss now about risk considerations. Here asset, vulnerability, and threat are the main three components for that. Any item that has a value to the organization is called asset. Examples: information or data, network equipment, servers/computers, software, personnel, processes. Any weakness in the system design, implementation, software code, or lack of preventative mechanisms is called vulnerability. Examples: software bugs, misconfigured software, misconfigured network devices, improper physical security. Cybersecurity professionals control vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are internal factors. Any condition that can cause harm, loss, damage, or compromise of an asset is called threat. Examples: natural disasters, cyber attacks, breach of integrity of data, disclosure of confidential data, malware. Cybersecurity professionals cannot control threats, but they can be mitigated. Threats are external factors. Probability, or likelihood, of the realization of a threat can be called as risk. Vulnerability without a threat equates to no risk. We will now discuss assessment of risk. Here the first step is to identify the threat. Threats come from both external and internal sources, but most risk assessors think of internal sources first. We aren't just worried about hackers, but also the trusted insider. As you design security controls, don't forget to think about disgruntled employees, inept administrators, or the insider threat. It can be helpful to get copies of a similar organization's risk assessment. The second step is to identify the vulnerability. During the identification of threats, we generally look external to the organization, but identifying vulnerabilities focuses on internal factors. Our focus is to match up vulnerabilities to the threats identified. If you have a threat without a vulnerability, it isn't a risk. Threat. Hackers are using a zero-day exploit against Windows XP systems. Vulnerability. We don't use Windows XP systems. Risk. None. If you have a vulnerability without a threat, it isn't a risk. Threat. Hackers haven't found any exploitable coding errors. Vulnerability. Unpatched operating system software. Risk. None. The third step is to determine the likelihood of occurrence. Likelihood is the chance that the risk will be realized. What is the likelihood that the threat will initiate the risk? That is, how likely is it that the hacker attacks us? What is the likelihood that if the risk occurs it will have a bad impact for us? That is, if the organization has proper security controls. The threat may be mitigated with no adverse effects to the organization. Likelihood is qualitative as low, medium and high. The fourth step is to determine magnitude of impact. Always assume the threat takes place and the risk is realized when measuring. Identify the severity of the impact. Consider each of the pieces of security triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Impact is qualitative as low, medium, high. The final step is to assessment of risk. Qualitative measurement is subjective. Quantitative is based on numbers. Cybersecurity professionals work to minimize risk to the organization through risk management and controls. 4 ways to handle risk: risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk mitigation, risk transference. Risk acceptance. Organization accepts the risk associated with the system's vulnerabilities and their associated risks. Risk acceptance is common when the risk is low enough to not apply countermeasures, or adequate countermeasures have already been applied. Risk avoidance. Risk is too high to accept, so the system configuration or design is changed to avoid the risk associated with a specific vulnerability. Example: utilizing Windows XP is too dangerous, so we install Windows 10 instead to avoid the risk of an unsupported operating system. Risk mitigation. Main goal of security is to minimize risk to a level acceptable to the organization. Our goal is not necessarily to eliminate all risks. By adding risk controls, we can mitigate the risk down to an acceptable level. Risk transference. If the organization cannot afford to accept, avoid, or mitigate the risk, they can transfer the risk to another business. Example: if the organization is concerned that it would be too costly to recover from a flood, they can purchase flood insurance. Risk controls are of 2 kinds of. First one is technical controls. Systems, devices, software, and settings used to enforce CIA requirements. Examples: using firewalls, IDS, and IPS. Installing antivirus and endpoint security. Second one is operational controls. Practices and procedures to increase security. Examples: conducting penetration tests. Utilizing standard operating procedures. The term phishing is derived from phishing. Password plus phishing equals phishing. Phishing is the act of sending a communication, email, message, fax, SMS, to a user falsely claiming to be an legitimate enterprise brand in an attempt to scam the unsuspecting user into disclosing sensitive private information that can be used for identity theft. The attacker generates an email that appears legitimate and requests the recipient to perform some action. The attacker sends the email to the intended victims in a way that appears legitimate. Depending on the content of the email, the recipient tricked. To open a malicious attachment. Complete a form. Visit a website, etc. The attacker harvests the victim's sensitive information and may exploit it in the future.